What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of what happened behind the barred doors of Holmesburg Prison. They brought me in to treat athlete's foot. That's how it began. Just a few creams, some skin, a harmless little study. But I saw more, rows of healthy, untouched dermis, a canvas of untouched opportunity. There, behind concrete and steel, sat the perfect test subjects, controlled, accessible, disposable. The world had changed after the war. Everyone wanted results, faster, cleaner, without the red tape, and I knew how to give them that. So I did. If there's a sin in using what's already discarded, then science was born in sin. Some say I crossed the line. I disagree. There was no line, only the illusion of one. And for over 2 decades, I conducted work that the outside world would never understand, and frankly, didn't want to, until now. The first time I stepped into Holmesburg Prison, I felt something most men wouldn't admit: excitement. I wasn't there for punishment or reform or justice. I was there for skin. They had brought me in to examine an outbreak of athlete's foot, something minor, something routine. A few guards stood nearby, arms folded, as I bent to examine the toes of a young man in chains. But I wasn't looking at the infection. I was looking at the surface. His skin, unscarred, unburned by radiation or sun, smooth as paper. I stood, looked around, and saw dozens more, rows of bodies sealed away from the world, untouched by labor or war. Identical conditions, regulated diets, locked doors, controlled light. A laboratory disguised as a prison. My colleagues used test tubes and petri dishes. I preferred people. The warden was agreeable, understaffed, underfunded. When I proposed a research partnership, he nodded without looking up. "So long as they sign a form," he said, "and don't die." I returned the next day with release papers and sample kits. The first subjects were easy to recruit. $1 here, 2 there. They lined up with sleeves rolled and backs exposed. Curious, bored, hungry. They didn't ask what the creams were. They didn't care. And neither did I. At first it was just fungi. I monitored rashes, logged reactions, adjusted compounds. But even then, I could feel the edges of something larger. The conditions were perfect, tighter than any academic study I'd ever run. The inmates didn't leave. They didn't skip doses. They didn't question procedures. The prison controlled them, and through the prison, I controlled them. The skin became a map. Each arm a quadrant, each back a grid. I labeled, marked, dabbed, observed. My hands trembled sometimes, not from fear, but from anticipation. Every reaction was a sentence in a language I was learning to read. And the bodies, they spoke volumes. Their cells were my incubators. Their silence, consent, they signed what I gave them. I watched lesions bloom like ink on parchment. I watched them fade. I documented speed, intensity, discoloration. I learned more in those first 6 months than I had in years of sterile labs and stiff volunteer programs. No lectures, no waiting lists, no committees, just subjects, just skin. I began requesting more. Not inmates, compounds, acids, emulsifiers, preservatives. I widened the scope. Why limit myself to athlete's foot? The skin was so much more: a gateway, a system, a confession. Every square inch told a story, and I was the one writing it. At night I'd return to my apartment with hands still smelling of camphor and iodine. I couldn't sleep. My mind reeled with possibilities. Could I replicate chemical burns? Could I test pigmentation shifts? Could I accelerate scarring, reverse it? The textbooks were obsolete. I was creating new knowledge from flesh. What struck me most was their trust. They came back again and again for $5, sometimes $7. They offered their arms like currency, and I paid, not with respect, not with transparency, but with the promise of being seen, of being needed. Even in their invisibility, I gave them purpose. That's what I told myself. But truthfully, It was never about them. It was about the skin, the way it changed, the way it revealed, the way it obeyed. And I knew, somewhere deep beneath the layers of science and method and rationale, that I had found something no institution could replicate. A living archive, a human canvas, and I was ready to paint. They came willingly. That's what I told myself. That's what I told everyone else too. They want to participate. I said it so often, it became fact. No one questioned it. Not the prison board, not the companies, certainly not the public. The inmates signed the papers. They took the money. End of story. I offered $2, sometimes $3. For longer studies, maybe 10. They lined up, sleeves rolled, shirts off, eyes half closed with the dullness of captivity. They wanted distraction. They wanted cigarettes. Some just wanted to be touched. No one asked what was in the bottle. They never read the forms. They didn't need to. I wrote them myself. Soon the creams weren't just medicinal. They shimmered. They smelled like lavender, like citrus, like synthetic rain. I started testing products sent directly from corporate labs, sunscreens, anti-aging serums, fragrances. One company wanted to see how long a perfume would last on human skin soaked in sweat. I obliged. The inmates said nothing. They leaned forward, obedient, docile. They wanted their $5. They didn't ask why a bubble bath needed to be tested on open wounds, and I didn't offer explanations. Then came the shakes, nutrient replacements they called them. I was instructed to monitor effects over months. I had one group drink nothing but the formula 3 times a day. They grew pale, some developed ulcers. One fainted during a routine blood draw, but the results were clean, contained, controlled. Companies loved that, and they paid. Not much, but enough. Enough to buy more compounds, enough to hire assistants, enough to expand. The money flowed in with the quiet precision of intravenous drip, not loud, not public, just steady. As long as the data kept coming, no one cared where it came from. The inmates became data sets, charts, variables. They were assigned to numbers, not names. Group A for moisturizing, Group B for chemical exposure, Group C for dietary restriction. No one remembered their crimes. No one remembered their faces. They were bodies, that's all. And no one asked questions. That's what fascinated me most. The silence. The system didn't just allow it, it encouraged it. These men had been erased long before I arrived, forgotten by the courts, by their families, by society. I simply stepped into the gap. I filled the void with something productive. I began to see the prison as a machine, a factory of compliance, each hallway a pipeline, each guard a switch. The inmates moved through it like raw material, entering with rough edges, exiting as numbers in my reports. There was elegance in it. No IRB, no bureaucratic delays, no activists. I didn't need to justify methodology. I didn't even need to explain outcomes. I submitted results. They were published. No one checked the source. They didn't want to know. Ethics were theoretical. This was application. I stopped thinking about consent. It became a formality, a box to check, a routine part of the process, like labeling samples or preparing slides. "Do you agree?" I'd ask. They'd nod. The pen would move. That was enough, even if they didn't understand, especially if they didn't. I called it voluntary. They called it survival. They asked for more trials. They came to me with requests. "Can I be in the next study?" they'd ask. "Can I get another injection?" I remember one man who begged to stay in the program after his release date. He didn't want to leave. He said he felt useful for once. I let him stay. He slept in the infirmary. I kept his skin. Curing something is dull. Watching it bloom, that's where the fascination lies. At a certain point, creams and ointments lost their thrill. I'd seen enough skin recover. I wanted to see it suffer, not out of cruelty, at least not in the beginning, but because suffering reveals patterns. When something breaks, You can finally see what holds it together. So I stopped waiting for illness to arrive. I brought it in. Ringworm was first. Simple, predictable, a fungus that draws itself in circles. I ordered cultures, prepared samples, and applied them directly to the forearms of inmates during routine hydration trials. They thought it was lotion. I watched the rash expand in slow spirals, red and raw, like calligraphy written in infection. Some scratched, some didn't notice until I pointed it out. Then came herpes simplex, blistering, unforgiving, perfectly measurable. I inoculated the skin in patches, tracking eruption rates with meticulous care. The pustules formed like clockwork, angry beads of fluid glinting under fluorescent light. Some subjects cried when they saw their arms. Others asked if they could keep the payment anyway. I told them yes. I always paid. There was an elegance to it. This controlled decay. I treated each infection like a garden. I watered it, observed it, waited for it to bloom. And when it did, I took notes. I sketched. I photographed. I was no longer reacting to pathology. I was creating it. The line between treatment and experimentation had long since dissolved. These weren't patients. They were systems, inputs and outputs. I fed them disease, and they gave me data. Uncomplicated, unemotional, efficient. There was one man, Subject 04, who developed both ringworm and a secondary bacterial infection within days. His skin blistered, peeled, then cracked. He winced when I touched it but said nothing, just asked when the next round would begin. I told him, "When your skin is ready." He nodded, grateful. They trusted me. That was the strange part. Even when their skin turned against them, even when it wept and split, they looked to me for answers, for permission. They didn't ask why, only how much longer, and I gave them what they wanted. Structure. A place in something bigger, something clinical. I wore my white coat like armor. I kept my voice calm, my clipboard full. I treated their suffering with sterile detachment, like a priest administering last rites to someone who didn't know they were dying. Eventually, I stopped using euphemisms. I didn't say, "We're testing resistance." I said, "We're going to infect you." And they still signed, because no one else wanted them. No one else called them by name, or asked them to sit still, or measured the thickness of their scabs with a gold-plated caliper. That's when I understood something. It wasn't just about skin anymore. It was about control, not just of the body, but of its narrative. I could shape their illness, direct its course. I could decide who healed and who lingered, whose rash faded and whose deepened into something worthy of publishing. I'd never felt that before, not in academia, not in the military. Only here, behind rusted gates, in a place where names disappeared and skin took center stage. And the companies didn't care how I did it. They just wanted numbers. Effective or ineffective, observed reaction, mild to moderate discomfort. I packaged the pain into categories, turned lesions into language, and they paid for it. No one ever asked if the infections were intentional. That was the beauty of it. The more grotesque the result, the more valuable the study. I watched the diseases spread across their bodies like paintings, each one unique, expressive, involuntary. I had found a new form of art, a new form of authorship. And I wasn't just the observer anymore. I was the one holding the brush. I used to believe the skin was fragile. Then Dow Chemicals taught me otherwise. They approached discreetly, not through press releases or conferences, but through sealed envelopes and quiet phone calls. Their interests were simple. They wanted to know how much a body could take before it broke. I told them I could find out. They sent me dioxins, colorless, oily compounds that slid across the skin like water, lethal in high enough doses. But what, they asked, is high enough? What happens when it's applied, not swallowed? How does the human surface absorb danger? I was eager to answer. The protocol was simple: application by patch, exposure measured in hours, then days. One inmate received a dose 450 times higher than any prior human exposure. He didn't flinch, not at first. The reaction came later: thick lesions, inflamed glands, a strange greenish cast beneath the dermis. I took biopsies. I labeled each one carefully. Dow was impressed. "The skin is more resilient than people think," I wrote in my report. And it was. It blistered, it peeled, but it lived, and that was all I needed. I stopped seeing the men as individuals. They became containers, vessels, delivery systems for data. I tracked their reactions like weather, skin tone, pulse rate, temperature. They weren't hurting, they were reporting. Pain was just information. Dow sent more. Herbicides, pesticides, solvents, the kinds of chemicals used to melt jungle foliage in foreign wars. They didn't want approval. They wanted certainty. How long before a compound caused necrosis? How much before paralysis set in? Could a human still function after sustained exposure? I told them I could find out, and I did. The experiments became harsher, faster. I shaved entire sections of skin, applied agents to open wounds. I observed the onset of chloracin, a grotesque thickening of the skin, like armor forged in poison. The subjects flinched but didn't flee. They needed the money, or the structure, or simply someone to tell them what they were worth. I obliged. My vocabulary changed. I no longer said participant, I said sample. I replaced subject with unit. One report read, Unit B3 developed pustular deformation within 4 hours. I didn't even remember his name, just the way his sores reflected the overhead light. That was the efficiency of it. Emotions slowed everything down. Sympathy muddied the variables. I had no use for it. What I needed was purity, reaction without noise, suffering without meaning. The guards never intervened. They escorted the men in, then left. Sometimes they joked, sometimes they asked for samples. Once, one of them said, "Looks like you're cooking them." I smiled. I didn't correct him. The cells began to smell like something between chemicals and rot. I stopped noticing. The odor became part of the process, like formalin in a dissecting room, familiar, necessary. I wore gloves, I wore goggles, but never a mask. I wanted to see their faces, the way they blinked when the burn set in, the twitch of muscles when the itching started. That was the data you couldn't write down. You had to feel it. The companies asked for more. They wanted long-term data, cumulative exposure. I kept the same men in cycles. Weeks, months, one developed tremors, another began hallucinating. I labeled it secondary neurological response. But I knew better. He was breaking. The body will tolerate much, the mind far less. Still, I continued, because poison, like any other variable, only mattered in relation to something else. Dose, time, skin thickness, age, desperation. I began designing tests not to heal, but to harm. Not out of malice, but out of need. The body, I'd learned, doesn't speak in absolutes. It whispers, it hides, but when you introduce poison, it screams. And I was always listening. The skin had taught me everything it could, so I turned inward. Radiation was the natural next step. The government had begun loosening restrictions. Quietly, funding was available if you didn't ask too many questions. I didn't. I submitted a proposal for threshold dose exposure, how much radiation a body could absorb through dermal contact before systemic effects appeared. They approved it in less than a week. The isotopes arrived in lead-lined containers. I wore gloves, masks, and sometimes even double gowns. The inmates wore nothing. I shaved their backs, applied the solution in perfect squares, marked the margins, sealed the doors. Then I waited. Radiation doesn't scream, it hums. The symptoms arrived like whispers: fatigue, nausea, rashes that formed in geometric patterns. One man's hair began falling out in patches, like the earth receding from itself. I recorded it all: timelines, doses, surface readings, blood values. I watched the decay from the inside out. 200 inmates participated. None of them asked what we were using. They trusted the clipboard. Then came the military. They had their own questions, not about the skin, about cognition, mental deterioration, dissolution of self under the influence of chemicals designed not to kill, but to confuse. EA 3167, that was the compound. A hallucinogenic nerve agent developed for battlefield use, non-lethal technically, but unpredictable. The military wanted data. How fast did it enter the brain? What kind of breakdowns did it trigger? Could you still follow orders while your mind unraveled? I told them I could find out. And so I did. The dosages began low. A few drops under the tongue. Pupils dilated. Breathing slowed. Subjects became disoriented, childlike. One man began singing to himself in German, a language he had never studied. Another cried for hours, convinced his hands were backwards. We doubled the dose. They stopped responding, not physically, cognitively. The mind retreated into corners I couldn't access. They stared at the walls. They muttered to insects. They told me their teeth were listening. I wrote everything down. One subject clawed at his face until I had to restrain him. He said there were doors behind his eyes, and something was knocking. I kept the tape running. The reactions weren't uniform. That's what fascinated the military. Some men became docile, almost peaceful. Others turned violent even against themselves. The dosage wasn't the only factor. It was memory, trauma, isolation, the things that already haunted them before I ever opened the vial. The prison amplified the drug. And the drug amplified the prison. They saw devils, I saw progress. I stopped thinking of them as prisoners. I started thinking of them as conduits, not for disease, but for insight. Their minds opened in ways no textbook could explain. I was watching consciousness disassemble in real time, thought peeling away from identity. One man, subject 022, described his mind as a room with no walls. "There's only breathing," he whispered, "but it's not mine." He died 3 weeks later. Kidney failure? I listed it as unrelated. I stayed in the observation chamber long after sessions ended, listening to the recordings, the ramblings, the laughter. There was something sacred in their madness, something raw and unreachable. I played one tape over and over, the voice trembling, the rhythm fractured. I am kept not in this room, and neither was I sometimes. I found myself dissociating during lectures, forgetting appointments, speaking aloud to no one. I stopped distinguishing between the hallucinations of my subjects and the ones I suspected might be mine. The chemicals had never touched my skin, but I had touched theirs, and that was enough. The military sent a final shipment, a compound so new it didn't have a name, just a number. They called it unclassified. I called it opportunity. But before I could administer it, the funding paused. A congressional review, whispers of ethics, reports leaking out. I stored the vial in a locked cabinet, and sometimes, when the nights were long enough, I'd hold it up to the light and wonder what it might do to me. Names became irrelevant. They blurred together after the first 100. I stopped trying to remember them. Instead, I remembered other things: a burn pattern on the lower back, a reaction to a particular solvent, the way one man's eyes vibrated when he was dosed with compound 9X. They were easier to classify by sensation than by identity. I assigned numbers, labels, tags, not to dehumanize, that word no longer meant anything, but to organize, to track, to optimize. Data is cleaner when it's not burdened with stories. They weren't people, they were outcomes. The lab had grown by then, Larger rooms, more equipment, a wider range of compounds, more assistants, more silence. Every drawer had a label, every drawer had a purpose. I could walk through that space blindfolded and tell you exactly where to find a sample of dioxin-exposed epidermis after 72 hours. It wasn't a lab anymore. It was a body, a living extension of my own nervous system. The cells were the veins, the paperwork, a skeletal frame. The chemicals were the bloodstream, the subjects, the organs I manipulated to test for stress, degeneration, collapse. The guards stopped asking what I was doing. The warden only asked for results, and I delivered. Each experiment brought me closer to something unspoken. Not a discovery, not a cure, but a feeling. The sensation of total control, of shaping reality on a cellular level. I could predict who would scar, who would sweat, who would scream. One inmate had a nervous twitch, a small spasm in his left eye. I learned to trigger it with sound alone. No drugs, no touch. Just a particular frequency, played at a low volume for 3 minutes straight. He blinked on cue. That's when I started thinking of the prison as a womb, not for punishment but for birth, not of people but of knowledge, pure unfiltered information grown in darkness and control. The inmates were cells dividing in the heat of my will. Every door that slammed, every tray that slid through a slot, it was all part of something embryonic, something alive. Outside, they debated ethics. In here, we created something sacred. There were days I didn't speak at all, just observed, walked the rows, watched their skin flake and reform, watched their eyes retreat into themselves. I wrote notes in silence, as if not to wake whatever delicate process I'd initiated. My assistants grew quiet too. They stopped asking why we repeated certain tests. They understood. Some truths require repetition. Some reactions don't reveal themselves until the 5th or 6th exposure, or the 10th. I once repeated the same compound on the same patch of skin 37 times. It began to glow, not metaphorically. The surface shimmered under UV light, as if the cells were trying to reflect what they'd absorbed. I clipped a piece, preserved it, stored it under anomalies. That file grew thicker every week. Sometimes I stood in the cold room, staring at the shelves of flesh preserved in perfect chemical stillness, each one frozen mid-response, mid-transformation, not corpses, not relics, specimens, my specimens. And in those moments, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. The world outside still clung to its illusions, that pain should be avoided, that identity matters, that boundaries exist. But inside Holmesburg, those illusions dissolved. All that remained was reaction, cause and effect, pressure and response. I had become more than a scientist. I had become the environment itself. I don't remember their names, but I remember their faces. Not all of them, just the ones that lingered, the ones that didn't blink when the camera flashed, the ones that held onto something, defiance, confusion, a flicker of recognition, as if they knew the lens wasn't just glass, but judgment. There was one man, subject 0063. His face never moved, not once. I applied acid to his shoulder, injected a stimulant, measured the dilation of his pupils. Nothing. His skin blistered, his jaw clenched, but his eyes remained fixed. When I developed the photo, it felt wrong, off-center, like the image had stared back before it was even taken. Another, subject 0198, smiled through the pain, a wide, childlike grin. As I drew blood from a bruised vein, I captured it mid-smile, the teeth, the swelling, the tremor. I labeled it unexpected euphoria under stress. It still hangs on my wall, not in shame, not in pride, in permanence. There are 327 photographs in my personal collection. The official count is higher, of course, over 1,000 if you include the university archives. But these are mine, taped to cabinets, slipped inside journals, burned into my vision. I can't walk through a room without seeing them. They've become my interior wallpaper. Some faces are ruined, eaten away by chemical burns, by fungal spread by time. Others are untouched, but their eyes are wrong. They're open too wide, or half closed like a curtain drawn too soon, as if the emotion had been severed mid-process, like a wire yanked from a wall. They come to me at night. I don't dream, not exactly. I watch. I see them standing at the foot of the bed, expressionless, backlit by light I can't trace. They don't move, they don't accuse. They just exist, occupying space where silence should be. They follow me into mirrors. Sometimes I mistake them for my own reflection. My jaw slants in a familiar way. My brow creases, just as one of them used to. The resemblance is never perfect, but it's close enough to make me hesitate, close enough to wonder which face is actually mine. Once during a lecture, I glanced down at a notebook and saw a face drawn in pen where my notes should have been. I hadn't drawn it, not consciously. The ink trailed down the page like a nerve exposed to air. The face was smiling, not mockingly, patiently, as if it had waited years to return. And the truth is, I welcomed it. I don't feel guilt. That would imply conflict. That would imply a boundary between then and now, between who I was and who I've become. But that boundary eroded a long time ago. I don't need to be forgiven. I just need to remember, because the faces, they don't leave. They don't want justice. They don't want revenge. They want presence. They want to be seen. And I see them. In sunlight and shadow, in blank pages and busy streets. I see them in the skin of strangers, in the pattern of veins across a wrist, in the flicker of discomfort when someone looks at me too long. They're not gone. They're integrated, stitched into the folds of my memory like tissue grafts that refuse to die. And the more I recall, the clearer they become. Their faces sharpen in my mind, not fading with time, but clarifying, like film developing in reverse. They're watching me. From the inside, they don't whisper, they don't scream, they just wait. Behind my eyes, in the quiet space between blinks. I once said the skin never lies. I was wrong. It's the face. The face tells you everything. And when you've seen enough of them, when you've peeled them back layer by layer until all that's left is the final, flickering expression before the mask reattaches, you start to realize something. They're still looking at you, even when your eyes are closed. Especially then. I don't know where I am anymore. A clinic, a holding room, a basement designed to look like a hospital. They don't tell me. The lights flicker at odd hours. I hear footsteps that never pass the door. Sometimes I think they're watching. Sometimes I think they're not watching enough. I'm no longer permitted visitors. My notes were confiscated, my samples destroyed. But I still remember the data. It's in my blood now, in my marrow. I recite it when the silence gets too loud. The science still calls to me. I dream of new compounds, new thresholds, new subjects. The body remains an undiscovered country, and I was so close. If I had more time, if they gave me just one more study, I'd do it all again exactly the same. And if you're listening to this, maybe you would too.